Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Callie Cawthon Friels. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a premium tutor here at Applerouth. I'm so excited to be spending this evening with you talking about how to become a stronger writer. I think writing can sometimes be a subject that really intimidates a lot of students. So hopefully we can make this feel a little bit more approachable tonight. And by the time we finish the session, hopefully you will have some strategies for yourself or to share with your students if you are here on behalf of a student or two, and be able to provide them some skills or some practices that they can use to strengthen their writing all around. So before we get into the main event for this evening, I just want to give you a quick glimpse of where we're going to go. We will have a time for Q&A at the end of tonight's session. So if you have any questions throughout the program, please hold on to those and go ahead and write those out. We'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation this evening. So please, please, please be sure to put them in. So before we get into the actual content of becoming a stronger writer, I just want to kind of share a little bit with you about Applerouth's why. Applerouth is a company that does so many different things related to education. We'll get into that here in a minute. But at the core of everything we do, in every interaction we have with families across the company, whether it's the folks who are sending some materials to students or the tutors like me who are working with the students directly, um, we believe that when you change a student's self-beliefs, you can change their lives. We care a lot about what our students think of themselves and how they view themselves. If they're really just down on themselves all the time and saying, I'm not smart, I'm not good at this. And so one of our biggest challenges as a company is how do we engage students and help them build these mastery experiences so that they genuinely do believe that they're capable. So the way that we do that across the company is we really focus on three core areas of education. So tonight's webinar falls pretty squarely into that academic tutoring bucket, but can be applied across all of these areas where we strive to help students. So academic tutoring can be anything from academic support in K through 12 education and also into college. We work with a lot of college students as well. Test prep can be anything from your APs to private school admissions exams like the SSAT or the ISEE, and of course the bread and butter ACT and SAT for our college admissions. We also do things like the GRE. And then the other kind of bucket or area where we strive to help students is executive function coaching. The way that Jed Applerouth talks about that is like the invisible syllabus of school. So the things that are really intuitive to some students, but maybe not as intuitive to others, like building an organizational system so that they know where all of their assignments are, building a schedule so they know when they're working on certain assignments and know when those things are due. And even when they finish those things, remembering to turn them in. So some of those skills are really intuitive for students, and for other students where their frontal cortex is still developing and like the parts of the brain that's involved in decision making and prioritization, it's kind of a challenge. So we strive to help students there as well. So that way they can showcase their academic abilities a little bit more clearly when they're in the school setting. So that's just a little bit about, basically where we're coming from tonight in terms of how do we best support students, not just so that they get the grades that they want and improve the skills, but so that they can be more confident in themselves as young learners. Okay, so let's get into the writing bit of things. This is what I'm really excited to talk with you all about. I love, love, love helping my students be able to become better writers, and you'll see why in a minute. But first, a quick history of writing and education. So most folks believe that it was a widespread, agreed upon thing in the public sphere that literacy became necessary around the age of the Industrial Revolution. And part of that has to do with safety in the factories. If you need to post a notice or something like that, you want to make sure that your employees can read those notices. And it's also a quick way to get memos out to folks. If everybody can read and write, everyone can understand the memo that's going out, and then whoever's in charge doesn't have to repeat themselves. So that's where a lot of the importance of writing came into play in the public sphere, but there are also lots of other benefits to teaching folks to write. It makes it a lot easier to communicate across departments and all kinds of good stuff. So education since the Industrial Revolution has advanced, thank goodness. We want to make sure that we're continually growing. And as we evolve and learn how the world works, we want to make sure that we can keep up with that. Um, However, with the influx of things that students need to learn, in the school system, there's just not enough time to get to everything. That's not a knock against any of our teachers or any of the education systems. It's just kind of a fact. The more that there is to learn, the less time you can devote to all of it. So when we get into the humanities, particularly in English, by the time students get to high school, the focus in your English class pretty much transitions from grammar rules to exposing students to as much good literature as we can, and making sure that they feel comfortable analyzing that literature, which is an incredibly important skill. I cannot underscore that enough. So what that means is students may not necessarily have an intensive writing course that really focuses on structuring arguments and is just devoted to writing and not necessarily reading anything else until you have a writing seminar or your freshman semester of college. Usually classes like that involve really focusing on whatever style guide the university is using. So even then, it's a very focalized, specific style of writing, if you would, as opposed to learning how to do multiple kinds of writing. Okay. And as we've kind of discussed, writing is a fundamental skill for success no matter what industry your student chooses to go in. So if you're working in a more corporate space, of course, writing well is a key to success because you have to communicate with your colleagues through written communication. In working with my clients here at Applerouth, I can't tell you the number of emails that I send daily to parents and things like that. And so I need to be able to communicate my plan for their student clearly, so that they trust me and know that we've got a good plan moving forward. But even outside of the office job, writing is important across the board. If you're in a trade industry like carpentry or auto mechanics, you need to be able to express the problems with the vehicle clearly on the invoice so that your client knows exactly what they're getting charged for and why, right? So across all of the industries, writing is a goodness, what word am I looking for? Kind of mutual thing that is important across the board. There we are. So important across the board. But even with all of that in mind, the thing that I really enjoy most about working on with students when we come to writing, writing is a way to showcase your voice as a person. And when working with teenagers, one common theme that I see with them is that they want to be heard, they want to be understood, and they want to be seen. So if you're not so strong of a writer, it means that there is now this obstacle standing in between you and communicating your message to your audience, no matter who your audience is. That audience could be your parents, that audience could be your teachers, your friends, like whoever. So when we're helping students become better writers, we're giving them the key to unlock how to make their voice impactful. And that is something that will stay with students outside of the sphere of academics for the rest of their lives. So you can probably tell I'm a little passionate about this, but having a good foundation for understanding how to write different genres of things successfully in a way that clearly communicates your idea to your audience is a skill that everyone needs to have. Absolutely. Okay. So now we're going to get into some of the brass tacks of what exactly goes into good writing. And I think some of you may be surprised to see how much emphasis we put on the pre-writing, so stuff that we need to get done before the actual event of writing, and stuff that we might consider post-writing as we work through this presentation today. So part of the pre-writing exercises would be, frankly, just to know your goal. Like, you should know the why behind whatever you're writing before you sit down to write it. Generally speaking, prose can only accomplish three things. It can either tell a story, explain something, or offer an opinion. So even from kind of like, this broad strokes view, we want to be able to say, okay, well, which of these things do I want to do through this piece? Okay. And then once you have identified what we're doing, if we're telling a story, if we're explaining something, if we're analyzing something, then we can move to brainstorming and pre-writing. So anything that's worth writing deserves to go through some pre-writing. Very few people write something and it's perfect the first time, or not necessarily perfect, but it's where they want it the first time. That is an incredibly rare occurrence. So the beautiful thing about brainstorming and pre-writing is there's no one correct way to do it. All of our brains are wired a little bit differently. So some of the methods that we talk about this evening may work better for some students than for others. They also may work better for certain kinds of writing than for others. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we look at some of the examples. Okay. So one of the first ways to do some brainstorming and pre-writing is to do something called free writing. It's basically you and a blank piece of paper or computer screen, depending on how you prefer to write, and just getting words out. The goal of this is not at all to write anything coherent. It's not to have very smooth transitions between ideas. It's just to get all of the ideas related to this topic out. So if I were to write a paper on the benefits of owning a pet, right? Then I would write down every single thing that I love about having my two cats, Oliver and Wicket. Okay. All of those things may not make it into the final product, right? Because that's not the goal. Like once we have that big list of stuff from our pre-writing, like the goal isn't to figure out how do I get every single thing from this free writing exercise into my final product. It's more about what are the things that are most relevant from this free writing exercise and how can I connect these things? That's kind of the goal of it. The idea behind free writing is if we don't have the idea in front of us, we can't analyze it to see if it's worth putting in the final product. So if we have everything on there, like everything but the kitchen sink, then we can kind of prioritize what makes the most sense depending on the goal of that piece. Okay. So maybe you're someone who's like, that might feel great for people who feel a little bit more loosey-goosey, but I am an organized person and I need something a little bit more systematic than that. Don't worry, we got you. Another great way to do some pre-writing is by answering the journalist questions. So the who, what, when, where, and how of your essay. So if you're writing a history paper on some of the key conflicts leading up to the Revolutionary War, then you want to note who was involved in those conflicts, what they were, when they happened, where they happened potentially, and how that affected all of the events leading up to the Revolutionary War. The cool thing about the journalist questions brainstorming pre-writing exercise is you can apply that to a variety of writing styles. So if you're writing a short story for a creative writing class, who's your protagonist? What's the plot? Where does it happen? When does it happen? And how do the events affect the character, right? So you could do this for fiction, for nonfiction, and then various subgenres beneath those things. Okay. So then let's say that that sounds good, but you want something even more structured than that, then we can always resort to doing some outlining. So outlining is basically where you have a heading, which is the main idea or main argument point that you want to talk about, and then you would indent over a little bit and put some sub ideas underneath that. I personally really like outlining because I kind of treat each heading as its own paragraph. And then if I've typed it up on my computer, then I can kind of see like what ideas go well together and I can move pieces of the outline around until I see a structure that I like and say, yes, this is how I want to order my paragraphs. It's also a really great way to just see the breadth of what you have, right? So if you're writing a 5-paragraph essay for a class and you end up with an outline that's 3 pages long, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that outline's probably too long, right? Because the idea of the outline is to take the ideas that you have and then expound upon them based off of the way that you want to connect those ideas and your arguments and all of that good stuff. So at this point, some of you may be thinking, all of this sounds really great, but I'm a really visual learner, Callie. And so just seeing the words on the page or just like spewing out some free writing, like that sounds good in practice, but I don't think it's going to work for me. Don't worry, we've got you. So concept mapping is a much more visual way of organizing information. And so we'll look at three different commonly used um, concept maps. And so you can see a couple of examples and all of that good stuff. So first up is the T graph, so named because it looks kind of like a lowercase t, okay? So a T graph is a fantastic resource to use if you're writing an essay where you're comparing and contrasting two things, right? And so in our columns here, we've got the two things that we're comparing, right? So Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, good folks. But notice what's happening on the rows, right? If we just go down the list here, each row is related to each other. So that first row is what kind of animal are they? The second row is, well, what about their clothes? And the third row is, well, what about their personality? Right? So if we're organizing information, it's helpful to make sure that each row is about a similar topic. So you can instantly, just by looking at it, make the comparison between those two things. You can also use a T-graph when you're comparing more than two things. So if we wanted to add another Disney character on there, so Mickey, Donald, and Goofy, we would just come over here. I'm going to write on the screen just a little bit. And just kind of extend the T a little bit. Um, like so. And you would just do that for everything that you wanted to compare. But again, it makes it a little bit more visual. It makes it a little bit easier to see all of those things more quickly. Right, awesome. So then another great resource for when you're writing a comparison is to look at a Venn diagram. So Venn diagram is we've got two circles, and essentially what's going on with those circles is each circle represents a different thing, a different unit, if you will. So here we've got vampires and chocolate are separate ideas, but the overlap is what those two ideas have in common, right? So we can very clearly see the differences on the outer part, but then that overlap right here is what they share, right? And off the top of my head, I can't think of many more things that vampires and chocolate share than Count Chocula. But perhaps maybe one of our viewers wants to write a paper on that and can fill this Venn diagram out a little bit more. Okay. And then the third one that we're going to look at today is a bubble map. So this one is great when you're looking at writing just a more topical essay. And so if you're doing an essay on automobiles, here we've got like the little bubble that indicates all of the kinds of automobiles we would talk about. So then if we wanted to expound upon this a little bit more, what you would do is you would add more lines and more bubbles based off of whatever things that you're adding. So if we wanted to add an additional note about a car, we might say that it has four wheels compared to the others that have fewer wheels or something like that, then we would just create a new bubble directly connected to car, and so on and so forth for the other little prongs, if you will. So it kind of begins to look like a web almost, where we have this one central idea that connects everything else on the page. Okay, fantastic. So now that all is all pre-writing, right? We haven't actually gotten to the act of writing our paper or essay, whatever the assignment is. So this is all to make sure that we have organized our information so that we can write with purpose. You know, one of the things that is kind of a struggle sometimes for students who are just getting into the practice of really honing their writing abilities is kind of writing all over the place. And it's like everything is topically related, but does it really support your argument, right? Every sentence that we pick should connect to the other things around it and serve the point of answering some of these questions. So as you get ready to write, You want to focus on what the goal of that piece is and what your reader should take from it, right? And so we've got some examples of that here. If it's a narrative, um, what are they supposed to learn from the story, since narratives are generally more story-like? An analysis, what are we hoping the reader will learn from this? And have we explained it clearly enough that the reader will be able to tell somebody else about it? That's another big thing when it comes to writing with purpose. And then the argument would be like your persuasive ability, right? Like, what are you hoping your reader will get from your argument? Are you hoping that they will agree with you? Are you hoping that you will get them to reconsider their own viewpoint? All kinds of good things to consider when you're working through what kind of writing that you're doing. So if we have done effective pre-writing, answering these questions shouldn't be that bad, right? Sometimes when you have the information in front of you from your pre-writing, it kind of points you in a general direction. If you've done, say, a free writing exercise and you're writing a story, it's like pretty clear, like, okay, it seems like all of the notes that I have here are related to empathy. I really want my reader to bond with the character. Or if we're doing one of our T graphs, if we're writing a paper on the differences between Mickey and Donald, and perhaps we're really arguing that Donald is better than Mickey. Controversial, I know, right? So, what are some of the themes from that T graph that we could take and include in our paper to persuade our audience to agree with us? Okay, so again, if we've got good pre-writing notes, answering these questions should be pretty straightforward. Okay, but when in doubt, you can use a three-pronged thesis to get started, right? So this is particularly effective if you're in the stage of your writing career where you're really doing a lot of 5-paragraph essays, right? Because you have your introductory paragraph, a three-pronged thesis would give you the three kind of talking points, 3 paragraphs that you would have for your body, and then a conclusion, right? So here we've got a thesis statement. And I believe on the next page, we have the same one, a little bit different. Here we are. So in this pronged thesis, we're arguing that we can help reduce microplastic pollution by doing 3 things: purchasing reusable containers, supporting local agriculture, and making food at home. Okay, so that sets the writer up to very clearly talk about each of those 3 things in the body of their paragraph. So when it comes to writing, if you have the luxury of doing the assignment for homework and not for um, like an in school, in class, like timed essay assignment or something like that, then I would strongly suggest saving the introduction and conclusion for last. Like, you write your thesis statement first, then write your body paragraphs. But once you see how your body paragraphs evolve and support your thesis, then your introduction is supposed to be that, right? It's supposed to introduce your reader to what you wrote. You can't really introduce them to something if you don't have anything to introduce them to. So sometimes it can be an effective strategy to write your thesis, then do your body paragraphs, then write your introduction in its fullness, and then write your conclusion. Because again, your conclusion is supposed to just kind of recap what you talked about. You can't recap something if there's nothing to recap. But anyways, when we look at this thesis, that would likely be the last paragraph of that last sentence of that introductory paragraph. And that would allow us to flow between ideas here. All right, so with that, though, we also have to make sure that our paragraphs are organized, okay? We don't want to get into that habit of, I think we've all seen the meme where somebody is texting out a really long story and the image has been edited so that the phone looks like it's a mile long. Yeah, we don't want those for paragraphs, and I can promise you your teachers don't either. So we want to be able to clearly break up where ideas should be broken up. If we've done something like a 3-pronged thesis and we're doing a 5-paragraph essay, that's pretty intuitive. We would just break the paragraphs apart for each new idea. But if this was the topic of a longer essay. We're still using these 3 examples, but let's say instead of 5 paragraphs, it's a 10 paragraph essay. Okay, that gives us a little bit of room to talk about multiple things related to using reusable containers, or multiple things related to local agriculture, and multiple things related to food at home. So if we were to focus on transitioning between paragraphs there, we want to make sure that we mention something in the new paragraph that connects to the old paragraph. So let's say we're doing the reusable containers example. One paragraph may be dedicated to the benefit of reusable containers in terms of talking about how if you stack them correctly, they're easy to store, you know where they are, you know that they're clean, so on and so forth. So that could be one paragraph in and of itself. I might start the next paragraph by saying, however, reusable containers have other purposes as well. Some reusable containers are actually oven safe and you can use them for your cooking. And I would talk about how those containers are not then just food storage, but they're multi-purpose, and talk about how oftentimes those things are made out of glass, which is infinitely recyclable when used correctly, right? So then we've got 2 paragraphs, both about reusable containers. I've mentioned at the very beginning of my second one saying, however, that's not the only way that we can use reusable containers. So that lets the reader know that I'm still talking about reusable containers in this new paragraph, even though it's broken away from the first paragraph about reusable containers. Okay. So a great way to get feedback about your paragraph and asking your friends saying, hey, is this too long? Is to ask them, how many ideas do you think are in this paragraph? Right? Because every good paragraph should really just focus on one idea that has supporting evidence. If somebody reads it and says, it seems like you've got like 5 ideas going on here, that lets you know that you need to break it up a little bit. That's also a great way to give feedback, right? Because I know that particularly in high school and college, teachers often ask students to do peer-reviewed assignments where you each look at one another's paper and suggest a grade or suggest some revisions. So giving them some feedback saying, hey, this paragraph seems kind of long. It seems like you've got about 3 ideas going on here. I think it would be clearer if you could narrow that down to one focus point, but then let them choose where, because again, it's their piece. We're just giving a little bit of feedback about it. Okay. So when we're looking at that structure, transitions and transition words are incredibly helpful here. And when I'm working with students, frankly, they're non-negotiable. And transitions don't always have to look like starting a sentence with however, or doing it sequentially by saying firstly, secondly, so on and so forth. That's a great place to start. But as you grow as a writer, we want to look at ways to kind of zhuzh it up a little bit in terms of how we structure that. So, but kind of at the basic level, transitions are incredibly helpful vocabulary because it's not just about connecting ideas, but it's about helping your reader follow your train of thought. Right? One thing that I tell my students all the time is, you have to write this as if the person reading it isn't in your head. Right. And I don't know about y'all, but sometimes my brain goes all over the place in terms of how I get from point A to point B. Right. Sometimes I take a couple of turns and I want to make sure that I'm using effective sentence structures to guide my reader through that thought process. And transition words are super helpful in letting them know if the ideas I'm talking about are connected, or if I'm using kind of a word like but, which would be a contrasting statement, letting my reader know that, hey, I'm about to take a turn here. So we've got a list of some of the most common transition words in English. I definitely recommend taking a screen grab of this, just so you have this to reference. And you can see like the different kinds of purposes of those transition words. So kind of going back to one of the ideas we discussed earlier when we were talking about, well, what do we really what's the purpose of the piece? If we are really trying to argue something, might be using a lot of those emphasis ones, right? To really showcase to your reader the conviction with which you are arguing your point and whatnot. So we certainly won't go through all of these categories, because if you take a quick screen grab of this, you can reference this list on your own. And I would encourage you to play around with some of these. If there are some transition words that you use regularly when you write at school, maybe see if there are some synonyms on here that you can swap it out with every now and then, right? Because another thing that makes writing more engaging is the ability to diversify your sentence structure and to diversify your word choice, right? So once we get to a certain age, sentences like "this is Spot, see Spot run, Spot likes the ball," like aren't really going to cut it much anymore. So anything that you can do to avoid that repetition and diversify your vocabulary when you write is going to help make you a stronger writer. Okay. So I trust that if anyone wanted a screen grab, you got it. So we'll move on from this page. So now we've worked through our pre-writing and brainstorming. We've talked about the actual act of writing, and now we get to revision. Like I mentioned earlier, few people are able to write something down and it immediately be their first draft. Like, if somebody does that, like they have definitely been touched by some kind of power of the universe, because that's just not how it works for the rest of us. So when you are writing assignments for school, one thing that my students and I will do is we'll kind of work back from the due date and say, okay, if it's due on Friday the 13th, we need to we want to have it finished by, Wednesday the 11th. So you've got a couple days to review it, but our first draft is going to be due much sooner than that, right? So when we're planning out when to turn something in on time, we include revision time. And that's something that I'm going to encourage all of the students here tonight, or if you're catching this recording later, if you take nothing else from this webinar, you need to build in time to your writing schedule for revision. And it's not just about catching typos and whatnot, it's about making sure that the ideas that you're writing down still come across as clearly to you a couple of days later compared to when those ideas were fresh on your mind. Because if you can't follow your train of thought a couple of days after you wrote it, your reader is not going to know where you're going. So cannot underscore the importance of this enough. You need to build in time to do some revision. Okay. So whenever you're revising, it can kind of be overwhelming if you don't really have a clear sense of what revision should look like. It's not just sitting down and saying, okay, I need to read this to see if there are any problems with it, but how am I going to know if there are any problems with it if I'm the one who wrote it and it sounds good to me, right? That's not a really systematic way to go about revising something. So this is a good place to start. Does my essay have a clear, relevant thesis? Okay, that's like tick mark number one. And if it doesn't, that's something that we need to revise. Do I give specific details to support that thesis, to support my argument? Or am I saying just vague statements? If I'm writing an essay about, the importance of owning a pet, and I just say, cats make me happy, and move on to my next point, I have not given my audience evidence for why that statement is true. So giving specific details about how my cats make me happy would be a way to improve the quality of your writing. So then that third point, is my paper organized? Do I have clear paragraph breaks, and are the paragraph breaks in places that make sense? And do I transition between those paragraph breaks successfully? Or does it feel like all of a sudden I'm talking about one thing and then bam, whiplash, I'm talking about something else? If it reads like that, you need to include some transitions. And then sentence variety. Am I using a diversity of sentence structures here? Am I playing with my punctuation correctly? Right? That's definitely a topic for another time, but grammar rules, right? Using our knowledge of grammar rules to diversify our sentence structure. So it's not just this is Spot, see Spot run. And then word precision. Another way we might think about that is word economy, or being brief, being concise. So If there's a way to communicate your idea with fewer words, you need to use the fewer words because your audience will be able to absorb that more easily than if you wrote this really long, eloquent sentence that's like three lines long, beautifully constructed. But if your reader doesn't remember the point of that sentence by the end of it, doesn't really matter how eloquent it is, right? So if it's concise and gets the point across, then ultimately that's what's going to stick with your reader. Okay. So then receiving feedback can be stressful, right? So if you are going to give your paper to someone to say, hey, does my paper do all of these things, right? So maybe a way to revise is you give it this list a pass yourself, see if it hits the mark, and then asking a trusted friend or maybe a teacher, um, saying, hey, does my essay hit all of these points? Um, so it's always good to talk with someone you trust. And then when the tables are turned, when you are the one providing feedback, it's always good to make sure that you coach it from a place of good intent, right? And providing feedback is more than just pointing out every single typo in your friend's essay, right? If that's what providing feedback was, none of us would benefit from it. So feedback should involve these things. Saying, hey, the transition between your second and third paragraph feels a little bit jarring. I would recommend tweaking the transition there a little bit. It also involves pointing out what they do well. So if you notice that they use great sentence variety, highlight that. It's very much this idea of the golden rule, right? Like treat people how you want to be treated. If you would appreciate someone saying, hey, I like this part of your essay, take a moment to highlight what your friends do well as well. Okay. And providing feedback should also come from the place of wanting to build someone up, because ultimately that's how we want to receive feedback, right? Like earlier we talked about like changing those self-beliefs, working on building those mastery experiences. So being able to provide feedback that's more topical in nature and not necessarily just about pointing out typos is a really, really good way to work on kind of like that self-image and also helping others work on that self-image too. Okay. Right. Awesome. So then how do you get better at writing? Um, so we've got practice, right? Just like with anything, if any kind of discipline outside of writing. So if you talk to any great athlete, you talk to any great artist, any great musician, they would all tell you that they are good because they have put in the work outside of anywhere else. Like if you've got any basketball player who's in the NBA, like they would tell you that they are good because they do the work outside of the games. They do the drills, they do their conditioning, they do their stretching, all of that stuff. Writing is exactly the same way. Okay. So, how do you practice writing? And how do you promote this kind of growth? So, we're going to talk about a couple of things that you can just kind of implement into the daily rhythm of your life to work on growing as a writer a little bit. Um, and it really does come back down to this growth mindset. How you talk to yourself matters. If you tell yourself, I'm just a bad writer, then that kind of becomes a self fulfilling prophecy. You tell yourself you're a bad writer, so you believe you're a bad writer. So then you don't work on improving on your writing. So then you get a bad grade on it, which then just kind of reaffirms what you were thinking, anyways. Oh, I'm just a bad writer. Okay. So that's what we call a fixed mindset. A growth mindset looks at a mistake as an opportunity to learn something, right? And it's really cool, like the neuroscience behind this, actually. Like Jed could talk about this much more eloquently than I can. But basically, from a broad strokes perspective, our brain kind of works like if you're walking in the woods, okay? Anytime you learn a new skill, that's like walking along a trail. And the more times you do that skill, or the more times you walk down that trail, the deeper the path gets, right? Like the more clearly defined that path gets. So if you're thinking to yourself multiple times a day, I'm just a bad writer, I'm no good at that, it's going to make a pretty deep path in your brain. But when we instead approach it with a question and say, I didn't get the grade I wanted on this, what can I learn from this? That sparks the creation of a new neuron path in your brain, which is incredibly important for a healthy brain, first of all. Like, that's incredibly important for a healthy, developing brain, but it also just really helps improve brain function overall. And that instigates the opportunity for new learning paths in your brain to create connections between different things that it hadn't been making before. So by looking at a mistake and treating it as an opportunity to learn something new, like, you can learn more from that experience than any positive experience out there. And so this is ultimately where we want students to land, right? When we talk about like changing their self-beliefs, like nudging folks over to that growth mindset is one of the best ways that we can do that. And so one of the best ways that we can facilitate that is providing opportunities for students to grow as writers in places that feel a little more safe, right? So potentially on things that aren't graded is a really fantastic place for something like that. So a great template for if you want to become a better writer is to keep in mind the 3 R's in quotation marks. So read, write, which I know starts with a W, but for the mnemonic, thinking of it as the 3 R's helps. So read, write, and revise. So oftentimes people learn by imitation. If you want to learn how to be a good writer, read good writers. If you want to like write musicals, like, you read and watch good musicals. If you want to be a novelist, you want to write mystery novels, you read the best mystery writers, right? So you can learn a lot by reading for the purposes of learning something and not just to enjoy it, right? So that's something that you can do. If you want to become a poet or you want to learn something about poems, read some good poets, and then take the time to ask yourself, what have they done here that made this poem successful? How are they using rhyming schemes? What kind of diction are they using here? And then seeing how you can incorporate that into your own writing. So that, frankly, is one of the best things that you can do to become a better writer, is to become a more avid reader. Okay, so when you do read from that purpose, for the purpose of analyzing, for the purposes of saying, okay, well, what are they doing and how can I implement it into my own writing? This kind of answers some of the questions that we talked about when we talked about you finding your purpose for the piece that you're writing. So if we can answer these questions about the text that you wrote, that will give you an opportunity to later look at those responses and really reflect on, how can I incorporate some of these good things into my own writing? Okay. And then another way to promote growth as a writer, we talked about the first R, read. The second, quote, R is to write more. So some great exercises that are pretty low stress for that: morning pages. So morning pages are basically, you get up and the very first thing you do is write stream of conscious for 10 to 15 minutes. And if that sounds like a long time, maybe the first time you try it, you set your timer for 5 and you build up to 15 minutes. And the goal here is not necessarily to write anything that you plan to use. It's just to get your pencil moving. It's really about building the practice of writing frequently. It's kind of like a warm up, if we're thinking about athletes and whatnot. Typically, before they immediately start going to play the game, they do some stretches. They take a couple of shots on the court. They maybe run a couple of drills with their teammates. This is the writing equivalent of that. You get up for the day, you're doing your warm up, and then later you can focus on maybe what some of your assignments are. And who knows, like, you may end up writing something that's really cool and you end up using it for a piece later on. Okay. Another fantastic exercise when we talk about like word precision and using as few words as possible to communicate your idea, is to kind of throw back to Twitter, and take maybe an essay or something and see if you can summarize it using only like the OG short tweet, 180 characters, right? Because if you can summarize a big idea in that small of a space, that means, first of all, whatever you read was quality, right? Like the author was able to communicate their idea clearly. And second of all, that means that you're developing that ability to communicate complex ideas in a straightforward fashion that's a lot easier for other people to read. That is an incredibly important skill. This is actually an assignment that I had to do in grad school, um, working through a book on like philosophical theories and stuff like that. And it was challenging. So this may seem kind of silly, but if you can do this successfully, like good on you. Like it's a fantastic skill. And I am indebted to the professor who made us do that for that book. Okay. Other things that are a little bit more creative is just to like find some prompts. So like taking some images and saying, okay, well, what's happening here? There's so many um, questions we could ask ourselves about this image. Like, why are they all looking at me? Um, right? Like, did I do something embarrassing here? Or why are they all kids? Right? Where are the adults in this image? Is this kind of like a Rugrats scenario where the kids go on these adventures and whatnot? Um, and the toys that they have maybe seem a little bit outdated. Have we time traveled? Right? So just kind of asking yourself questions about prompts like this or just images. It's a great way to start the creative process if you're doing a creative story. Okay. And then finding other prompts. Like there are so many books out there of just prompts that you can get for relatively inexpensive. Some of them are even daily writing journals. Like I know that Target has some where basically at the top, they give you a prompt and then they give you a couple of words that you have to incorporate into your story. So you could do that as kind of a daily exercise, or you could take some of the prompts here as well. Um, and then we also have more on the analytical side. This is for those of you who are just like, the other stuff sounded cool, but I'm not a creative writer. I don't like writing stories. That's okay. We got some practice for you too. So you can find statements like these and ask yourself if you agree or disagree and work on your persuasive abilities, right? And finding evidence to support these things. Okay. And for our high school and college students here, I would even encourage you to push beyond that a little bit more, as opposed to looking for just a strict agree or disagree, like moving beyond that binary thinking and focusing on nuance. So the example here, all good things come to those who wait, and it was a prompt from the previous page. We were asked if we agreed or disagreed with that statement. And so for me, I'm just like, the situation kind of matters, right? For baking a cake, it's good to wait until the cake is finished baking, right? So in that case, that is a good thing that comes to us now that we have waited. But during a race, you kind of need to go when the ref says go, right? So taking an opportunity to say, is there a third or fourth or fifth perspective that I can take on this question that I've been asked? And how do I articulate my reasoning for going beyond just the agree or disagree binary? So that's a particularly important skill for our high school and college students to really dig into, because that's more of what's going to happen when you're doing your college assignments. Okay. Another, like a great way to see how attentive to detail you are is to see how thorough your explanations are when you're telling someone to do something, right? So you can do, writing out a recipe for something that you cook, or you can write out in detail how to teach someone to do something that you already know how to do. And then the way that you test how the quality of that is that you give that paper to someone and say, hey, follow all of the steps here to a T and see if they miss anything, right? See if there's something that they don't do that you do, but they didn't do it because it wasn't on the paper. So this is a fantastic exercise for seeing how detailed you are in your writing. Okay. And again, we've talked about revisions as well. We plug it in here. one last time, because again, we cannot underscore the importance of revision. Um, Make sure to build in time for revisions into your writing assignments. Like 100%. That is like, if you get nothing else out of tonight, like please, please, students, take this. Okay. And then at the end of the day, when all else fails, keep writing. Writing is a skill that you can always improve upon. I'm at this point 6, 7 years out of grad school, and I still have opportunities to polish my writing. It's something that you can that grows with you as you get older. So just keep at it. The way that we get better at this is by doing it. So absolutely, please keep doing that. All right, so we're going to take a look at two things real quick. So first of all, if this was interesting to you and you're like, wow, this was amazing, I would love the opportunity to talk through this with one of Applerouth's instructors. We would love to talk with you about that. So we have a writing workshop that is tailorable to students between the grades of 5 and 12. And so one-on-one tutoring experience that comes with a curriculum that was designed by Applerouth instructors who have degrees dealing with English and writing and all of that good stuff. I've worked with it through it with some students, and it is really fantastic. It breaks it down, and it really is tailorable across all of those grades. So then you would be able to schedule with that tutor at a time that is convenient for you and be able to get feedback on what your student is working on. So you should be getting a link in the chat with an opportunity to schedule with one of our program advisors if this is something that's interesting to you. And if you were listening earlier when I was talking about executive functioning coaching, the kind of the invisible syllabus of school, if you would, and thought, hey, that sounds pretty cool. We also would love to talk with you about setting up a diagnostic package. Right, so basically, it's a non-commitment way to learn a little bit more about executive function coaching. We do an assessment to help students identify their growth areas and strengths when it comes to executive function skills. And you would be able to see that report and then go over that report with an executive functioning coach. And after that, if you choose to continue with EF coaching, you would work with your EF coach one-on-one to create a plan that works the best for your student to help them get on track in terms of staying on top of those EF skills. All right, well, that is it for this evening. Thank you all so much for coming in. We are now going to move into the question and answer portion of this time. We also have a quick poll for you that we would like for you to fill out. You should be seeing a link for that in the chat momentarily. And we would just ask that you would take a quick minute to fill it out. Literally takes about a minute. And then we will also monitor the chat to see any questions that come in, and that could be related to the content that we talked about this evening. So we'll give you a minute or so here because I definitely don't want to cut anybody off if you're frantically typing any questions that you may have. I feel like these moments, it may be helpful to have some background music or something while folks are typing up their questions. All right, fantastic. Well, we haven't seen any questions come in. And that is totally okay. So if you have any questions later, because I know I am definitely of the I am of the persuasion where if I get a lot of really interesting information. I may not have a question immediately, but after I reflect on it for a while, I might have a question. If you are like that, you can email info@applerouth.com with any questions that you may have later. And in the meantime, I hope you have a fantastic evening. It has been a pleasure to spend this hour with you. And I hope that you gained some skills or got some skills that you can pass on to your students that really do make a difference in how they view themselves as a writer and really help them build that confidence. So thanks so much. Have a great evening. Bye.